First of all, when we're talking about educational technology, what are we talking about? The sort of language that's emerging in DFID policy at the moment is up on the screen there: digital or electronic technologies and materials to support teaching and learning. I think if you look at the literature over a period of time, there's a transition from talking primarily about forms of technology to talking more about the educational processes and communities and practices that are involved in the use of that technology for teaching and learning. And the Technology Enhanced Learning Research Group have got the definition on there that it's in technology itself doesn't enhance learning. It depends on how it's designed and implemented, on how teachers are supported to use it, how outcomes are measured, and what communities are in place to support it. So I think when you talk about educational technology, you have to think not just about the technology, but about all those aspects of the wider context of use. Evidence. The guide was produced really to address a perceived gap in the evidence, and this is sort of summed up, but this isn't particularly a development context that we're talking about here. This is from a Journal of Research in Technology Education. It's looking at first world contexts primarily, but even in that context they're saying there's a real difficulty for educational policymakers in terms of making decisions around educational technology and what is helpful and what is not in the use of that, because there's either inappropriate evidence to guide those decisions, or the evidence that there is may not be presented in ways that are helpful to decision makers. If we sort of look not at the research community but more around sort of donors and policymakers, and in a development context we see similar sort of things reflected. This is the Asian Development Bank review from 2012, and they looked across education systems in Asia and came to the conclusion that actually there's a big emphasis in most of the systems on hardware provision. People talk about the technology and the hardware as if that solves problems by itself. There's not actually an awful lot of emphasis on how that hardware and technology is being used and what kind of context make it meaningful. And I think we see in the sort of the language of that reflections of the issues that were being raised in the educational technology field. So the purpose of the guide: to contribute to the evidence base that links educational technology and educational outcomes, to appraise the evidence that we can find in current literature, particularly looking at two areas. One's the evidence that the use of technology by teachers affects teaching practice or learning outcomes, and also the use of technology by students, and again looking at their learning practices and learning outcomes. And finally, to try and make some practical recommendations, particularly with the audience of DFID education advisors in mind, as to what kind of things can they do that will help get more effective programs up and running. Okay, right, we've leapt straight in. We're going to quickly go through the findings, and first of all we're going to talk about the findings that were around forms of educational technology used by teachers. So this thing where the teacher might be using technology for professional development, they might be using it with students in a classroom, but essentially the teacher's in control of the technology rather than students sort of directly hands-on. And there was a lot of evidence. I'd say the majority of the evidence of impact related to interactive radio instruction. Part of that might be because it's been around for a long time and is well accepted, so there's time to accumulate those evidence. Range of effect sizes on learning outcomes, the World Bank 2005 finding average effects around 0.5. A lot of variation in that from more recent reviews, and I think interestingly the Hohenthal review found that the strongest effects, the IRI, was seen to be most effective in terms of improving learning outcomes for very young, getting tongue-tied, very young learners, particularly sort of class 1 and 2, and diminishing effect sizes for older learners. There was lots of evidence about the impact on learning outcomes for IRI. There's actually very little about how that changed the process of learning, what happened in the classroom that was different as a result of IRI. The only two that we could find are here. I'm not going to attempt to translate the Sula Fromage, but it seems a strange project name to me, but that's definitely what it said in the paper. This was a program in Guinea that, as well as interactive radio instruction, it had face-to-face support meetings for the teachers. And they did qualitative observations of the classroom, and they found two things changed. The first is a very modest change in teacher behaviour. I hope we'd set our heights higher than this. It's about decreased teacher violence. They found teachers hit students less often as a result of the programme. But perhaps more importantly, they found that teachers also took time a little bit more. Instead of rushing through the curriculum after the programme, they gave more time for students to develop their understanding and think about the ideas that were being presented to them. Another programme mentioned in the Hohenthal review was in Mali, and again this wasn't just IRI, but it was IRI in conjunction with teacher development programmes, and I think the radio was used as part of the teacher's INSET as well as for the classroom practice. And they found increased teacher awareness of the techniques that were being promoted by the programme and increased teacher use of those techniques year on year over a number of years that the programme was implemented. Now, I know no one's going to be able to read this, don't worry, that's not the point. We've got this graphic here because actually this is one of very, very few examples where there was quantitative evidence of changes in classroom practice. So don't worry about what it says, but the gist of this is the grey bars are year on year, so it's 2005, 2006, 2007. The top set for each of the things, the top set is the teacher's awareness of the pedagogic technique that's being promoted, increasing year on year, and the lower set is on teachers' use of those techniques being observed in the classroom. And that kind of quantitative evidence, how did classroom practice or teachers' understanding change, with some measurable objective indicator associated with that, is extremely rare, and that's why we've put this here. Okay, another example that we found that had lots of evidence of change in classroom practice and learning outcomes was again from the use of audio in the classroom, but this time by mobile phones rather than interactive radio instruction. This is from English in Action, Bangladesh, and there were several studies over a number of years that provide evidence of changes in teachers' perception in classroom practice and learning outcomes. These were large-scale systematic observations of classroom practice repeated in 2011, 12 and 14. Significant increases in the use of the target language English, significant increases in students' talk time from negligible to sort of 20–25%, and increased use of pair and group work being observed in the classroom. Again, very unusual to have quantitative measures of changes in classroom practice. EIA is again one of, I think, 3 examples of that we found. Also, this is unusual in that it has evidence of changes in classroom practice and evidence of changes in learning outcomes, both of which in quantitative form. Very often we find one but not the other. And EIA found 35% more primary students achieving grade 1 or above in the English language competence assessments and 20% more secondary students achieving grade 2 or above at the end of the intervention compared to before. Another example of teachers using mobile technology in the classroom, this time to present video material rather than audio. This is Bridge IT, a program that used the Nokia education delivery system. 2 studies, one in India, one in Tanzania, looking at mobiles to provide video, and again in the context as ongoing support and professional development for the teachers. It's not just a technology delivery program, but they've got a professional development program. Again, systematic observations of classroom practice, 31% of increase in lessons rated high quality. I couldn't find anything in the literature to unpack that. So what was it that they were observing that meant this was a higher quality lesson than what they'd identified as a delivery? And I looked everywhere and could find nothing that unpacked the nature of the observation that led to that statistic, but it was interesting that it was a quantitative measure again. And again, unusual that they've got both the classroom practice and the learning outcomes. Tanzania gains 10–20% over controls in maths and science. In India, gains in science but not English. They were really significant studies because there were very few other examples of teachers' use of IT that we found such evidence of impact. The other one that stands out is the Primer study in Kenya. This is quite complicated. They had 3 groups. They had some groups where students had technology, some form of tablet device themselves, other groups where the teachers but not the students had some form of tablet device, and other groups where the teacher educators had the tablet but not the teachers or the students. What they found was that the teacher or the educator tablets both produced the same levels of change in student learning outcomes, and what they were focusing on was early literacy. I think that very interestingly this paper found that because the teacher's device was more expensive than the students, but you only needed one of them as opposed to lots of them, it cost about 10 times more to give the technology to the students than to the teachers. But giving the technology to the teacher or the teacher educator produced the same learning outcomes. So they concluded that the cost effectiveness of giving educational technology to the teacher was very much higher in their intervention than the cost effectiveness of giving the technology to the students. That was about the only paper in all of the things that we reviewed that addressed the issue of cost effectiveness and linked changes in learning outcomes to the cost of technology and program design. So one of the gaps that we think is that there's a real issue here about understanding more about how you assess cost effectiveness in these kind of programs. Right, computers per se, I'll have to pick up the pace a little bit. Generally speaking, we found lots and lots of papers that found no evidence of any change in teaching practice or learning outcomes from the result of computers. A few standout ones there. There's the first review of 1 laptop per child in Peru. Despite increasing the access to computers tenfold, the program didn't seem to have any effect on the quality of instruction in class, and laptop use was generally directed to activities that had little effect on educational outcomes. That kind of theme was common in many, many papers. Lots of examples that giving children computers absent other things really doesn't make an awful lot of difference, and sometimes even in the context of enormous investment. A couple of examples, 2 or 3 examples where we found a different outcome to that, and they all had features that it was a teacher development program, and it was a focus on promoting project or inquiry-based learning, and it was supported by curriculum resources for the students to use. And they all found more independent or collaborative work. And interestingly, 2 of the studies there where the students, when they were interviewed about the programme, said, actually, we don't want one computer each. It's much better for us to work in groups because we learn from each other if we work in groups, and students suggested groups of anything from 3 to 5 as being optimal. Limited evidence around computer-assisted learning in mathematics. I don't know why mathematics and not any other subjects, but this was not as a replacement for other lessons, but as a supplement, either for disadvantaged students or students who are perceived to be underperforming, and there seemed to be some benefit as a kind of remedial or supplementary program for computer-assisted learning in mathematics, and a few papers that evidence that. So, in summary, we think an awful lot more needs to be known about how to support and enable teachers to introduce change in their practice. That was something that wasn't spoken to very much in many of the papers. What was it that was done that enabled the teachers to introduce the change where those changes were seen? And we need to know a lot more about how those practices are enacted. What actually happens in the classroom when teachers take these technologies and use them? How does that change the nature of what's going on? In terms of education advisors, we think that we should be promoting programs and proposals that either further develop practices that have already been shown to be successful, and the kind of things we've been talking about, the IRI, the mobile technologies for the teachers' use, the learners using e-readers and things like that, or that address gaps in our knowledge. So how do you better support teachers to enable those sort of changes? What kind of new innovations might there be? We think advisors should discourage proposals that emphasise technology over education or give weak programmatic support to teachers or poor evaluation. And the final area is that we think that there needs to be much more work done in terms of developing value for money metrics and thinking about the ways in which we approach cost effectiveness evaluation. Thank you.